Family disappears on a remote camping trip, only to be found burned alive in their own car and camper. A bunch of backpackers vanish in the forest, but one lucky survivor barely escapes and leads investigators to an arrest. And in Montana, campers face a deadly night as grizzly bears turn the wilderness into a nightmare. These are terrifying camping encounters that are pure evil. In the summer of 1982, the Johnson and Bentley families headed out for a camping trip in British Columbia's Wells Gray area. 6 people in total: Bob and Jackie Johnson, their daughters Janet and Karen, and Jackie's parents George and Edith. They called relatives once on August 6th, and then nothing. When Bob didn't show up for work a week later, people knew something was seriously wrong. A month went by before anyone found a clue, but then a mushroom picker stumbled on the family's burnt-out car deep in the woods. Inside were the bodies of the 4 adults. In the trunk were the 2 girls. The case was huge in Canada at the time. For a whole year, nobody knew who was responsible for this. Police even hauled a replica of the family's camper truck across provinces to see if anyone recognized it, but it wasn't until October of 1983 when the missing camper was finally discovered. Just like the car that had been found over a year earlier, this one was burned, abandoned on a logging road not far from the original site. This was the key that tied everything back to a local guy named David Shearing, who eventually confessed to stalking the family at their campsite, killing the adults and then turning on the kids. In 1984, he pled guilty and was given life with no parole for 25 years. In September of 1992, 2 young backpackers from Britain, Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters, set out to explore Australia's Blue Mountains. Weeks later, their bodies were discovered in the Belanglo State Forest. Walters had been brutally attacked with a blade, while Clark had been taken down with gunfire. Detectives believe the person responsible had toyed with them, dragging things out instead of ending it quickly. At the time, nobody realized this was just the beginning. Over the next year, the remains of 5 more young travelers turned up in different parts of the same forest. A German student and couple, plus an Australian pair. They were left in shallow graves, some covered with sticks and leaves. It was becoming clear there was a serial killer on the loose. But who was it? Well, it turned out there was one surviving witness, a British backpacker named Paul Onions. 2 years before bodies started turning up, Paul had been hitchhiking in Australia and was picked up by a man named Ivan Millet. Well, Mr. Onions immediately noticed a rope and a firearm in the car. 2 things you never want to see right beside each other when climbing into a stranger's vehicle, which you should never be doing in the first place. Onions took off running, with Millet in pursuit along the highway. Onions barely escaped, flagging down another driver who took him to the nearest police station. At the time, police barely acted though. They just handed him some cash and sent him back to the UK. It wasn't until years later, when news about all these bodies being turned up, that Onions contacted Australian authorities and was like, hey, you remember my case? I nearly died in that area. You might want to look into this guy. So Paul Onions was then flown back to Australia in 1996 to help finally tie Ivan Millet to the killings. In August of 1967, Glacier National Park in Montana became the scene of a horrifying night that would later be called the Night of the Grizzlies. 2 young women, both 19, were camping in different areas of the park when they were attacked by grizzly bears. The first attack happened around midnight. Julie Helgeson and her boyfriend were camping nearby when she spotted a bear approaching. The bear went after both of them, but ended up dragging her into the woods. Just a few hours later, at Trout Lake, another bear attacked Michelle Coons, who was camping with friends. Coons woke up as the bear investigated her sleeping bag. She screamed, and while her friends climbed trees to safety, the bear dragged her away about 300 feet. They waited in the trees until dawn before running to report the attack. After the attacks, park rangers were ordered to shoot any bears found near the sites. 4 bears were killed over the next 2 days. Postmortems confirmed that 2 of those bears had been responsible for the deaths. Back in the winter of 1924, 3 fur trappers were working in the Deschutes National Forest in Oregon. Edward Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris had moved into a remote cabin to trap animals through the snowy months. They were last seen in mid-January, when a friend left after visiting the cabin. After that, no one heard from them. By April, people started getting suspicious. Their traps were found unattended, and the cabin looked abandoned with burnt food in the pots. The table had also been set for a meal, but no signs of people, aside from the pools of BLOOD in the snow and clumps of hair near the lake. But finally, when the ice over Little Lava Lake thawed enough to search by boat, the bodies of all 3 men floated to the surface. Autopsies showed they'd been killed with both firearms and blunt objects. At least 2 of the men had been lured away from the cabin. Police quickly identified a suspect, Charles Kimsey, who'd had a history of robbery and attempted unaliving, and he was tracked selling furs from the victims. Kimsey was eventually imprisoned for a separate crime, and while he was the prime suspect, no one was ever convicted for the trappers' deaths. It's one of Oregon's oldest unsolved cases. This next story comes from Reddit user Peaches and Mangoes. It goes as follows. Back in 2021, my husband and I were camping in Wyoming at the Boysen Reservoir. We got really lucky and were able to book a beachfront site directly leading to the water. The downside was that it was very, very far away from the other campsites. We were essentially isolated from everyone else. At the time though, it sounded like a dream come true. The thing about Wyoming is that it's so desolate to the point where it's pitch black and eerily dead silent once the sun is gone. We set up our camp, enjoyed our fire, but shortly after that, a random SUV with blacked out windows came driving down our road and into our site. They drove toward us. My husband tried to wave to them in case they were lost and needed help, but instead they ignored us and drove down to the beach, stayed there for 5 minutes, turned around and went back up the way they came. We immediately got a bad vibe. My husband told me to throw everything in the car, and he kept shining a flashlight toward the beach because we had a feeling they dropped someone off to watch us. After we packed up, we got in the car and hauled out of there. Lo and behold, the same car drove back into our campsite, and when they saw us leaving, they actually started chasing us. Mind you, the roads in Wyoming are bumpy and unkempt when you're in the wilderness, on top of that enormous wildlife that wanders in and out of the streets. We were easily going 80 miles per hour down these windy roads and even through a canyon. They were on our tail for about 10 minutes until we lost them after passing through the canyon. Late one night in rural Pennsylvania, Bigfoot hunter John Reed was out camping in his Winnebago, what he calls the dog house. At one point in the night though, rocks started smashing against the vehicle. Windows cracked, tail lights were damaged, and it was clear someone, or something, was intentionally throwing them. Reed flicked on his headlights, and that's when he saw it, a huge, hunched, brown-furred creature. The whole thing happened so fast, Reed could barely take in what he was looking at before it disappeared back into the night. If you're a fan of one of the greatest metal bands in recent memory, Children of Bodom, then you may have heard of this next case. In the early hours of June 5th, 1960, 4 teenagers were camping at Lake Bodom in Finland when an unknown attacker struck. By morning, 3 of them were dead. 1 was barely conscious, lying nearby with a broken jaw and fractured cheekbones. The tent had collapsed inward and was soaked with red stains. One of the campers had been dragged partially out, and the other 2 were found inside, all killed with a mix of stabbing and blunt force trauma. Personal items like clothing, wallets, shoes were missing or scattered in the surrounding brush, some half a kilometer away. Weapons were never recovered though. Eyewitnesses reported a blonde man walking away around 6 a.m., but no one was ever caught. The case went cold for decades, until 2004, when the one survivor, named Nils Gustafsson himself, was arrested. Prosecutors claimed that he'd killed the others and tried to fake his own injuries. He was acquitted in 2005 though, because his injuries made it impossible that that was the case. Evidence was weak, and the crime scene had been badly contaminated. There were other suspects though, including a local kiosk owner who allegedly confessed while intoxicated, and a former German soldier seen with bloodied clothes. Neither was charged though, and over 60 years later, the Lake Bodom case is still one of Finland's most infamous unsolved crimes. In September of 1974, the Cowden family went camping in Oregon's Siskiyou Mountains for Labor Day weekend. Richard Cowden, his wife Belinda, their son David and daughter Melissa, along with their basset hound Droopy, arrived at a campground near Carberry Creek. On the morning of September 1st, Richard and David were seen heading back from the local general store. That was the last anyone saw the family alive. That evening, Belinda's mother expected them for dinner, but found the campsite deserted. The family's truck was still parked nearby, and all their belongings were left behind. Milk from the store, a diaper bag, the camp stove, Belinda's purse, Richard's wallet and watch. Over the next 7 months, authorities carried out one of the largest searches in Oregon's history, but nothing turned up. Then in April of 1975, 2 gold prospectors hiking nearby found bodies. Richard had been tied to a tree on a hillside, while Belinda, David, and baby Melissa were hidden in a small cave. Police suspected local killer Dwayne Lee Little may have been involved, but he was never charged. He went to prison for other crimes, so officially, this case is still unsolved. In August of 1985, Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend Ruth Cooper went on a weekend camping trip in Pierce County, Washington. When they didn't show up for work the following Monday, their families reported them missing. 4 days later, hikers found Harkins' body near a remote campsite. He'd been shot in the head while still in his sleeping bag. Nearby, the couple's dog was also found dead. 2 months later, Cooper's skull was discovered about a mile away, and her body was found just 50 feet from it. A tube sock had been tied around her neck. Then in December of 1985, another camping trip in the same area went tragically wrong. Mike Reimer, his girlfriend Diana Robertson, and their daughter Crystal went looking for a Christmas tree. Crystal was later found alone outside a Kmart, saying her mommy was, quote, in the trees. Diana's body was discovered months later with a tube sock tied around her neck. Reimer had vanished. Years later, in 2011, hikers found a partial human skull that was confirmed to be Reimer's. But to this day, we still don't know who is responsible for what's been dubbed the tube sock killings. And this final case is super recent. Just under a week ago, campers at Loch Lomond came across human remains near one of the loch's most popular picnic and camping spots. It was around 12:40 in the afternoon when someone spotted the remains on the bank, and police quickly cordoned off the area. Forensic officers in white suits, sniffer dogs, and divers, they spent hours combing the shoreline and the nearby trails. The remains didn't seem to have been in the water long, but how they ended up there is still a mystery, and this is being treated as a potentially suspicious death. I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.